Welcome back to The Full View. The savage slide of the rand this week is not only bad news for investors, but could hurt motorists and taxi commuters. Earlier this month, pundits were predicting a small decrease in the price of petrol next month. But now it seems that we're driving towards another increase in the fuel price. This would be the sixth straight increase in the price at the pumps. Fuel fell below 14 Rand in February and March. It's been rising ever since. And 95 unleaded petrol inland, the most expensive form of fuel, is now soaring above 16 Rand per litre. The price at the pumps is determined by the level of the rand and the global price of oil. The rand touched 15 Rand to the dollar for a second time this week. These are levels before this week last seen in the middle of 2016, to put it in perspective. To discuss, we're joined by Layton Beard from the AA, the Automobile Association. He's live for us in Pretoria. Layton, what does the weakness in the rand mean for the petrol price next month?
Yeah, it certainly doesn't bode well at all, Francis. I think, you very rightly pointed out that the fuel price locally in South Africa is very much affected by international petroleum prices, international product prices, and then very significantly by the rand-US dollar exchange rate. And that's because we buy this international petroleum product in dollars and not in rands. And when it does go very badly for the rand, it just means that the product we're buying is becoming that much more expensive. So the weakness of the rand, the volatility of the rand, is certainly going to impact on the fuel prices going into September. It's still early days. I think we've seen in the beginning of the week the rand touching on 15 Rand 70 to the dollar. It recovered somewhat during the course of the week, and then again today it breached that psychological 15 Rand mark again. So it may obviously improve in the next week. It may weaken again in the next week. But really, it's very much up to what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks, what's going to happen to the fuel price. Obviously, it's not a spot price in terms of what we pay every day. It's averaged out over a period of a month. I'm talking now specifically about the fuel price. So if the rand is weak over a period of time, it most certainly will have a negative impact on the fuel price.
Do we have any idea if we stabilize at these sorts of levels, what sort of increase we're looking at?
If we do stabilize at this level of around 14 Rand 70, 14 Rand 80, we could be looking at anything between a 5 and a 15 cent increase. Obviously, again, dependent on international petroleum prices, which we've seen have also seesawed in the last couple of months, going up very steeply and then coming down. So there's no real stability in that price either. Again, I mean, in this range that we're dealing in, we could be looking at, and I don't want to say we will be, but we could be looking at anything in the range of about 10 to 15 cents. But again, I'd hate to put my head on a block and say that that is exactly what we're going to see. It really does need to average out over a period of time, and we'll have a much clearer picture towards the end of August of exactly what we're looking at in terms of an increase or decrease going into September.
I guess the point is that even if it's a small increase, it's the sixth straight increase in a row. So there's this cumulative effect for motorists.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, when we said at the beginning of August that we're only seeing a 2 cent increase, we billed it as being a breather for consumers. And I specifically say consumers and not motorists. And the reason being that although it was an increase, and it was the fifth straight increase we've seen this year, it wasn't a significant increase. And I think psychologically, consumers and motorists in South Africa would feel a lot better about their own finances if it came down even by 1 cent or 2 cents and there wasn't an increase that came into effect going into September. It's very difficult to speculate exactly what's going to happen. Obviously, we're keeping a very close eye on it. But at this stage, Francis, unfortunately, with the rand as volatile as it is, it may be more bad news at the end of the month going into September.
So Layton, currently, if you're living in Gauteng, the fuel has to be shipped in, transported via truck. So it's pretty expensive, and you're paying above 16 Rand for 95 unleaded. Is that expensive in sort of relative terms?
Yeah, it's very difficult to answer that question because what do you do, how do you classify being expensive? I mean, if we look at countries, in some European countries, they're paying 27 Rand a litre. When we look at some of our neighbouring countries, they're paying 10 Rand, 11 Rand a litre. So it is relative. I think what's very important in the South African context is that for South African consumers, 16 Rand a litre is a huge amount of money. It is very expensive. And I think when you combine that with the increase to VAT that we saw earlier in this year, and the economic financial pressures that consumers are under, just on an individual level. I mean, everybody's had to tighten their belts more than once this year. So I think it is relative in terms of where you compare or what you compare it to. But I think locally, a lot of people are going to say, you know what, it's just too much. We can't afford it. And we're buckling under the pressure. A lot of people are having to cut back in some big ways to accommodate this increase because they need to get to work. They have to pay increased fuel prices. They have to pay increased fares for public transport. So it is really going to hit hard if there is another increase. It's hitting hard already.
So, Layton, what sort of impact does this have? I mean, at what stage do we change our behaviour as South Africans? Because it's still noted that many of us drive our own cars to work. We're not carpooling and things like that.
Yeah, it's again, it's a tough question to answer because I think it's reaching people on a certain level. And I think what we've seen and what the trend is that people are cutting back on other things that they consider to be luxuries. So they're cutting back, for instance, on things like insurance. They're cutting back on, things like entertainment. They're cutting back on maybe grocery bill is being revamped to maybe cut back on expenses there. There are a number of things that people are looking at in terms of cutting back and making their budgets more streamlined to accommodate for these increases. There may come a point when even those cutbacks that they've implemented in the last couple of months aren't enough, and they're really going to have to start looking for alternative ways to get to and from specifically work, and maybe to also, drop children off at school, or get to church, or whatever the case may be. I don't think we've reached that point. Well, certainly maybe not a lot of people have reached that point, but it does raise a number of other issues. Is there reliable, safe public transport? And I think for a lot of people, the answer to that is no. And so I don't think we've reached that tipping point, but it may be closer to us than I think a lot of people realize. The cutbacks are certainly helping on an individual level. When those cutbacks no longer cut it, obviously people are going to be looking for alternatives.
And very quickly, where does the AA stand when it comes to those calls for government to cut back on the taxes, the levies, the contributions to the road accident fund, the things that augment our fuel price?
Yeah, I think obviously, these taxes are very high. We would like to see a debate on those taxes, a very intensive debate on exactly, where we're getting value for the money from those taxes. I think very importantly for us, when we do have increases to those taxes, they should be in line with inflation. And I think what we've seen in the last couple of years is that the increases to those taxes, the general fuel levy and the road accident fund levy, have been way above inflation. And that's just simply something that we think shouldn't happen because it's really putting a lot of pressure not only on general consumers and motorists, but specifically on the poorest of the poor.
All right, thank you very much for your time tonight. That was Layton Beard from the Automobile Association live for us from our studio in Pretoria.